So thank you. Obviously, we cannot talk about flexitarian alternative proteins without talking about meat. So I already asked the question whether you consumed meat the past week. And what we generally see is that people consume a lot more meat compared to the alternatives. So think about vegetarian options or insect burgers or seaweed burgers. This is a very big difference. And how is that possible? How is it possible that we talk so much about meat-reducing strategies and that meat is associated with all kinds of having a big environmental impact because it's not efficient to produce and it, for example, takes a lot of water to produce. It is also associated with health effects, for example, diabetes type 2 or obesitas, especially when we're talking about red-produced meat. And it's also obviously also often associated with animal welfare issues. So how is it possible that we are talking so much about these animal-reducing strategies, but that we consume so much meat? And that's where I want to talk about today. So I have three main topics. First, we are going to talk about what's the current situation. What do we see, for example, in the Netherlands at this moment when we are talking about meat consumption and alternative strategies? We're also going to talk about understanding behavior. Because if we're talking about meat-reducing strategies, you really have to understand why consumers behave in a certain way to kind of support different strategies. And finally, I'm going to provide some examples how you can support behavior change towards accepting more alternative proteins. But first, about the current situation. What we see in the Netherlands is that the meat consumption remains stable over time. So we're talking a lot about meat-reducing strategies, but at this moment, we see that the meat consumption levels remain stable, and that they are quite high. They're very much above the recommended levels of, for example, Voeding Centrum, and especially a lot above more dietary guidelines, for example, for the Eat Lancet Commission, who states to want a sustainable diet. So this is kind of in contrast with each other in how much attention it receives, whereas the consumption levels seem to remain stable. Though what we see regarding flexitarians and vegetarians and vegans is that there seems to be an increase. If you ask people whether they follow dietary restrictions, it's a very strict question. Do you follow these dietary restrictions for yourself? We can see that from 2016 up until now that there's an increase. And at this stage we can see that 7.1% of the individuals is flexitarian, a bit less, around 7% is a vegetarian, and around 2% is vegan. An interesting note is that this was a very strict question. So we really asked, do you follow a dietary restriction rule for your diet? If we pose that question more widely and ask individuals, do you not always consume meat? Do you sometimes consume less meat? Do you see yourself in that sense as a flexitarian? We see that there's 43% of the individuals that identifies with that. So there's a big difference in how you pose that question, whether people perceive themselves as being a flexitarian. What we see in any case is that it's increasing over time. And if we're talking about the acceptance of alternative proteins, for example, seaweed, cultured meat, pulses, insects, or fish, which is also an alternative for meat, we can see that from 2015 compared to 2019, the acceptance is increasing. People are more willing to try these different alternative proteins. We see also variation. For example, insects are a bit more scary compared to these cultured meat. But you can see that individuals are more and more getting open to try these different alternative proteins. Though, again, we see that behavior is not following in the same manner. So what we see is what we call an intention-behavior gap. Individuals seem to get more open, they are more and more willing to try, though if it's about the behavior, it's not there yet. there's a gap between the intentions and the behavior at this moment. So let's start talking about the drivers of behavior, of understanding behavior. We are having different groups, we already talked about them, flexitarians, vegetarians, and vegans. And they're often discussed as similar groups, but these groups are actually also very distinct from each other. And I provide some details, some examples to show you guys that these groups are also very distinct groups. What we, for example, see if we ask these individuals what important drivers for food choice are, we see for both groups that the more egocentric drivers are very relevant. For example, think about safety, sensory appeal, the tastiness of a product, health, affordability. Though what we see, which is interesting, is that sustainable production and natural content is more relevant for the vegetarians. So for this group, it's very important to position your product as a sustainable, organic, natural product. Whereas for the flexitarians, other aspects, the egocentric drivers are relatively more important. What we also see is that these groups consume different types of products. So for example, I'm going to be a bit quick through this one, but what you can see is that the flexitarians, they consume mostly animal-based proteins as a replacement of meat. So think, for example, on egg products or cheese products. Whereas we see for the vegetarian sample that they more often use non-processed plant proteins. So then you can, for example, think of pulses, nuts, mushrooms. So different types of products seem to be interesting for these groups. For the vegetarians, it seems more relevant to think of non-processed plant proteins, and also think of raw ingredients, or at least not the really mimicking meat. Whereas for flexitarians, these animal-based proteins are relevant. And also the products looking similar like meat, so mimicking meat or meat analogs, are more relevant for these types of groups. Going to skip this one. And if we take a closer look at drivers of acceptance, we, for example, already discussed these motives of food choice. For example, the health, price, convenience. And these are products individuals often state, why do you not accept, for example, seaweed or insects? They often come up with these motives. Though if we perform the analysis, we see that these motives are actually not that relevant in association with the intention. For example, the attitude is very relevant, being positive or negative regarding a product. Behavioral control, whether you're able to find these products and are able to afford them. And food neophobia. It's, for example, a trait I score quite high on. That some people have personal characteristics that they're more scared to try novel things, whereas other ones really like to try novel things. Though most interesting is that we saw that more unconscious affective drivers were the most strong drivers of the intention. So if we're talking about the acceptance of seaweed or insects of pulses, for example, social norms were very strong drivers. And that's, for example, what we see is that people look very much around. They look, what are other people doing? And is that behavior appropriate to do? And then they're also performing the same behavior. And we also saw that emotions are very relevant. So it's not only about providing very cognitive arguments, but also thinking about feeling-based positioning of products. Go to the next one. So the final block of my presentation, I would like to provide some examples of experiments we conducted regarding behavior change. So these experiments are often more detailed. I'm just going to provide 3 examples and provide a quick glimpse of these different experimental designs. What we, for example, did is we used insect burgers, and we asked respondents, we divided them in different groups, and we asked them to reflect on a specific insect burger product. And each group saw different types of these products. And so we could explore which types of products were most interesting to consumers, and also how we should position these products when you're talking about claims or the positioning or framing on the product. And what's interesting to note is that we had a very small difference. So we said, feel good about yourself and choose the healthy alternative, versus research shows and choose this healthy alternative. So one is more emotion-based and the other is more cognitive-based. And what we saw is that it's very relevant to have just the same product, just the same message, but add this emotional component. More individuals chose for that product. And this effect became more and more strong for novel products. So the more scary, the more novel a product is, the more individuals use their feelings to make their decisions and to accept that product. We also conducted a second experiment, which we conducted in a supermarket. It's an organic supermarket in the Netherlands, and we used big leaflets at the beginning of the supermarket. And the one was just a control condition. It stated, try this seaweed product once. The other was about the moral values, about the identity of individuals. And it stated, because sustainability fits you. And the last one was about social norms. So it said, because you can show that you're a sustainable person. And what we saw is that these social norms, the social environment, was most relevant in increasing the sales of seaweed products. So 14.5% more products was sold due to that flyer instead of the other ones. And the last example, this is about a menu in a restaurant. We tried to make small variations in the menu to support individual behavior change. And what we did is we changed the default option. So there was a menu, and in the first week, the chicken wrap was the standard choice, and you should actively ask for a beans wrap. Whereas in the second week, it was the other way around. So there was the beans wrap, the standard choice, and you could actively ask for the chicken. So in essence, you have the same options, but the standard differs. And we did the same thing with seaweed. And what we saw in the first week, when the chicken was the standard, that most people chose the chicken wrap. And in the second week, it turned around. Then most individuals chose the beans wrap. So by just turning it around, we really could change the choice of the customers. And we saw that the same thing occurred for the seaweed. And seaweed is, at least in the Netherlands, it's a more novel, scary product for individuals to try. But we could really change it around by just making a small adaptation on the menu. So if we're talking about this burger again, and we're now talking, for example, about a seaweed burger or an insect burger, we have to take in mind acceptance is increasing, though at this moment behavior is lagging behind. We can see different groups, and these different groups show different motivations, different behaviors, so please use this knowledge that these groups should also be positioned in different ways. And we saw that it's not only about finding rational arguments and cognitive arguments, but that these emotions, social norms, and also the context can be used to support behavior change. That was my presentation. Thank you.